Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled today to welcome the very distinguished Maria Tatar to the Fellows Colloquium. A brilliant scholar of folklore, she is the John L. Loeb Research Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures and Folklore and Mythology and Emerita at Harvard University. She is also a Senior Fellow at the Society of Fellows here at Harvard. Perhaps equally important, she is an alumna fellow of the Du Bois Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. One result of her fellowship period with us is the annotated African American folktales that she co-edited with Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Published in 2017, the volume has received many prizes, including the NAACP's Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work. Indeed, Professor Tatar is the recipient of many honors. She is the author and editor of numerous books as well, and the most recent are The Fairest of Them All, Snow White and 21 Tales About Mothers and Daughters, and The Heroine with 1001 Faces. And today, she will present from the second. Please welcome Professor Tatar.
Thank you, Krishna, and I hope my mic is on. Sound okay? Great. It's wonderful to be back, even if it's in a virtual format, and I look back with great fondness to my days as a fellow, that golden year, a time when I connected with a community of scholars, and at the Hutchins Center was a place of fellowship and friendship, of laughter and learning, and so much else. So thank you for that. Yesterday was a tough day, a day of anxiety and of great sadness for many reasons. Geopolitical concerns, the prospect of a land war in Europe, and then we learned about the unexpected tragic death of Paul Farmer at age 62. So last night, while I was busy doom scrolling, one of my bad habits, I came across a bright spot, and it was David Remnick's interview with Skip. And it was a wonderfully bracing reminder of how to face the challenges of daily life. And I wanted actually to start by, let's see, am I sharing my screen already? I hope. Krishna thought, yes, here's David Remnick. I wanted to share with you the end of that interview. And there Skip describes his mission. It is, let's see, I'm going to just move. He tells us about the story of the Black experience in the New World and how he's determined to tell that story in all its complexities and nuances. I was born to be a doctor, he tells us, for early on I realized that I had a boundless fascination with the stories that constitute Black history. And then he describes his mission, so many more stories about this magnificent drama remain to be told. Hence, we must make efficient use of the time we're given, leaving a legacy upon which other storytellers can build. This is what floats my boat. And this is going to be sort of what floats my canoe, my modest little boat. And I'm here today to talk about what I refer to as my pandemic book, The Heroine with 1001 Faces. And I want to talk about some of the women in it with a focus on Black heroines, more specifically, African-American heroines, as you can see from this pantheon of women writers on display. And you see in my title, Curiosity, Craft, and Care, that's going to be my focus. Those are the defining features of heroines. And I'll look to see how they're inflected for African-American heroines. And I wanted to just to quickly point out curiosity and care are etymologically related. I'll have more to say on that later. And I also wanted to highlight craft, which I use in the double sense of the term. First of all, as cunning, using your wits, designing, I always think of that sitcom, Designing Women. And then secondly, the arts and crafts, or the domestic crafts that have been women's work, spinning, sewing, weaving, and storytelling, which have led to the craft of talking and writing as well. So I wanted to start with a roadmap here, and you will see that, oops, go back a sec. The first half is going to be the genesis of the heroine with 1001 faces. And I want to take you back to Joseph Campbell in his book, The Hero with 1000 Faces, and also look at Clyde Ford's The Hero with an African Face, and then turn to Shaharazad and her 1001 stories. Shaharazad is a kind of foundational figure for me as I was thinking through what it means to be a heroine and how heroines are differentiated from heroes. And then for the second part of my talk, I'll look at African-American heroines, and again, the domestic crafts, the craft of writing, and what Skip has called the talking book, finding justice with words and stories, healing, mending, and making whole. And then 4 very quick, all too quick, I'm afraid, case studies, looking at Alice Walker's The Color Purple, Sewing and Writing, Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, an account in which we hear about how talk becomes revelation, a way of disclosing yourself, and a way of forming your identity. Barbara Neely's Blanche on the Lamb, which brilliantly makes the domestic arts, cooking and cleaning and sleuthing. And finally, I wanted to close with Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give. So here is, I wanted to stay with the pandemic for a moment. It was a time when we were, to let you know, why heroines? Why did I come up with that topic? At the beginning of the pandemic, we were, of course, all holding out for a hero. And this was a time when the possibilities for heroism were almost completely shut down for many of us. That is, we were told that we had to stay home. There was nothing that we could do, and everything became silent. There were some upsides to that: less traffic, more wildlife, more birds, but it was spooky. And Harvard Square became a kind of ghost, or Cambridge became a ghost town, and our towns were deserted. We learned the meaning of lockdown as silence filled the air. And it was around that time that I came across Carlos Fuentes' observation about how writing is a struggle against silence. And that was when I took to writing. Not as an act of heroism, but in a way, as a way to stay alive in both senses of the term, to stay animated, not just to survive. So many astonishing things, other things happened during the pandemic. And one of the things that happened is that we rebooted the concept of heroism. Soldiers, generals, warriors, spiritual leaders, all those heroes from times past lost their status. And in 2020, we removed 100 statues of Confederate soldiers, replacing them with emancipation and freedom monuments, honoring the enslaved and also the heroic survivors of slavery. So here you have, just one example, the Confederate general who was once in Statuary Hall in the Capitol was replaced by Mary McLeod Bethune, a civil rights activist and educator. So who were our new heroes? You see one of them, but also health care workers and scientists. And I emphasize here care workers, health care workers. Remember, care and curiosity. And also those driven by curiosity, by the desire for knowledge, by the desire to find a vaccine, scientists who wanted to make discoveries. So care and curiosity became important. And of course, these are the two features of heroines. What has driven women for so long. So who were our heroes? And today, many will still reach for Joseph Campbell's book from 1949. And Campbell's archetype, his hero archetype, is male-coded, male-centric, and of course, almost all of his examples are male. So in the Grammar of Mythology, Campbell told his readers, men are the heroes, and women represent the totality of what can be known. And the hero, Campbell sort of added this coyly and a little cryptically, the hero is the one who comes to know. In other words, women never really need to leave the house. They're either the mothers, the mother of the hero, or the goal of the hero. And you can see here from this most recent book jacket, and yes, you can judge this book by its cover. There's one lady there, Lady Liberty, who is a cultural construct more than anything else. Now, Campbell's book became the playbook for Hollywood for many decades, and in part through the PBS series, The Power of Myth, in which Bill Moyers was in conversation with Campbell. And Campbell became a kind of spiritual guru, a guide, and almost a household name. But part of the success of Campbell's work also came through Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey, which condensed Campbell's book and created an instructional manual for screenwriters. So Campbell's book became the playbook for Hollywood, and it almost became a kind of Bible for screenwriters. And remember, 1949, Campbell is writing the book in the war years and in the post-war years. US veterans are returning from combat. And so I think it's no accident that The Hero with a Thousand Faces focuses on warriors. And you have here the sort of 12-step journey. And this is really sort of post-Campbell that, the journey, the hero's journey became popular. And 12 steps in all. The important thing to remember is that you've got departure, the crossing of a threshold, and an ordeal, and then a return, with the hero coming back to civilization after a series of struggles, and coming back with what? With a boon, with an elixir, with a magic potion, with something that brings healing. Healing and making whole. And this gets to be amplified, I think, when we look at heroines and look at the missions that they are on. So what about Campbell's heroes? Achilles, Moses, Hercules, you can rattle them off. And here is a critique from Madeline Miller on the concept of the hero, not directly of Campbell, but she offers a kind of counter argument to what Campbell has to say. And she tells us, I love that Odysseus and Achilles are complete disasters as heroes. They're proud and angry, and they're not really the people you would want as ideal heroes. And here we have James Baldwin, who tells us in the United States, violence and heroism have been made synonymous, except when it comes to Blacks. In other words, that combination becomes toxic. It will put you in jail if you are Black. And PowerPoint has a mind of its own here. I think it's important to remember that Campbell really also tells us just half the story. He left out what George Eliot called the hidden lives of heroines, that is, women who have flown under the radar, who have worn cloaks of invisibility, and all those women who rest in what George Eliot called unvisited tombs. So heroines, I found, are not defined by the search for glory and immortality, which is what heroes are so often after, particularly in ancient times. Instead, what they do is they fight for their own survival and try to save others. And again, trying to heal and make whole. And of course, they never had access to the traditional weapons, to traditional weapons of war, but they did have words. They had words and stories as tools for finding justice. So before I get back to the African-American heroines that I previewed at the beginning of this talk, I wanted to take you on a quick little detour. This is a kind of serendipitous revelation that came to me because as I was preparing for this talk, I thought I'd take another look at Clyde Ford's The Hero with an African Face, 1999, so 50 years after Campbell. And what Ford noted, and what he was really annoyed by, is that while Campbell was trying hard to think globally and going all over the world, he had a curious blind spot when it came to African mythologies. And in fact, all of African mythology is sort of dismissed as mumbo jumbo. And you can see here, this is at the beginning of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, where we read about the dreamlike mumbo jumbo of some red-eyed doctor of the Congo. Oh, Campbell tells us everywhere the hero's journey is the same. And here are just some extracts from Ford's work. And you see death and resurrection. We have the mythological assignment of the female, which is to surrender. The male tries to acquire knowledge and becomes basically the sacred warrior. So what he does more or less is to replicate Campbell's findings, or to reinforce them, to show that they work actually all over the world. And lo and behold, the African faces suddenly share the features of Campbell's Thousand Heroes. So I confess, for me, that was something of a letdown until I realized that African-American heroes might be a little different. And coincidentally, last week, I also read Jason Mott's dazzling hell of a book, which I recommend to all of you. It's a book that I call it's a kind of metacognitive novel, because it's a book that gets us thinking about thinking. And what I was struck by is that the new hero, the hero in that book, who is called Author, acts a lot like the old heroine, curious, caring, and telling a story. And what was interesting to me too is that notice in that first bullet point, this is from the novel, no matter how much I want to ignore this call to adventure, Author says, I know I can't. And call to adventure is capitalized. So, it seems a very explicit reference to Campbell. And what Author is basically doing is engaging with ancestral trauma and loss, as well as with the Black Lives Matter movement. And he uses, I'm not going to go through all of these quotes, but he uses a textual voice, and I love that oxymoron, that's from Skip. He uses this textual voice to tell a story, to redress wrongs, and to repair, and also to make visible. I want you to see me, the kid tells the author, who is the voice. And that author, as I said, meets all of the requirements of the heroine. So curious, caring, crafting a story with craft. I want to turn now from Campbell to Shaharazad to give you the other half of my motivation for writing the book. And here is Shaharazad, the heroine with 1,001 stories. And by the way, the number 1,001 really captures the idea of a vast number. It's a swerve into something without limits. And I love that 1,001 because it gives us the endless possibilities for heroism. And in the frame story to the 1,001 Nights, if you recall, Shaharazad has volunteered to marry Shahryar. This is a man who has sworn to take a new wife on a daily basis and to slay her the morning after. And all of this is in revenge for the infidelity of his first wife. So how does Scheherazade manage to survive? Her strategy is to tell her husband's stories, cliffhangers. And what Scheherazade does is to delay the pleasure of the ending and to wait until the next night to finish her tale. So this is a woman who understands the seductive power of story, who saves her own life, and then, of course, spares the life of other women. And even more importantly, she changes the culture in which she lives, because Shahryar gives up his bloody vows. He repudiates those bloody vows, and he becomes a more just ruler. So Scheherazade became for me a foundational figure for understanding heroines. But Scheherazade, as you probably have guessed or have thought now, has always taken a backseat to Pandora of Greek mythology and Eve of biblical lore. Both of these figures succumb to the sin of curiosity, and they both bring evil into the world. So here's Pandora opening that box with all the ills of the world: disease, war, vice, toil. And so she shoulders responsibility for all of these things. And then here's Eve, who becomes the serpent in a way. She tempts Adam. She's the true villain. She's responsible for the fall. Oh dear. The host has asked you to start your video. Is that all right?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay.
You just disappeared for 1 second.
Oh, okay, I'm back. So there is Eve, and Eve's curiosity. I don't know whether that slipped out, but her curiosity is inflected as sexual rather than intellectual. So here's just this took me back to this question of curiosity, took me to the OED. And the question of how have we defined curiosity? And of course, if you look down at the bottom, you can see that, there's a downside to curiosity, a sort of negative side. You can be too curious, inquisitive. We think of people who want to know too much. They're nosy, they're snoops. And then there's curiosity in the positive sense, scientific curiosity, and just, the desire to know, to get to the bottom of things. But if we look at the top, we see all of these obsolete meanings, which include care, scrupulousness, careful application, proficiency attained by careful application, skill. And what I love is cleverness and ingenuity, that is part of curiosity. So what's important here is that curiosity and care were once synonymous, and that curiosity then bifurcates into a blamable sense and then a good sense. And I would say that those two forms of curiosity have been gendered by our culture, with the bad form associated with women. So I want to start with a story from ancient times and then move to Alice, to the second part of my talk, beginning with Alice Walker's The Color Purple. And I want to show here how women's spinning, sewing, knitting, and weaving are part of what I call the conspiratorial crafts. And all of those activities are really much more than textile production. And that spinning a yarn, weaving a tapestry, crafting a sampler are intimately connected with storytelling becomes evident in this tale of Procne and Philomela. It's a tale that is told by Ovid in the Metamorphoses. And if you've read this story, you'll remember that Tereus, you see him there on the left attacking Philomela. He rapes her and she threatens to rat him out. And how does he respond? He cuts out her tongue. And Ovid gives us an all too vivid description of that tongue quivering on the floor. And what he does is to deprive her of speech. And what is Philomela's response? She resorts to the domestic crafts. She weaves a tapestry which tells the story of Tereus's crime, and she hands it over to her sister Procne. and the two sisters ally themselves and exact a terrible revenge on Tereus. So we can see here a really sharp contrast to Campbell's heroes. These heroines are not on a journey. They usually can't get out of the house. They're on a mission, and they use their storytelling skills in whatever possible form to secure justice. Alice Walker, I think, had women's handiwork on her mind when she reflected on how, and she talks about the genesis of the novel of The Color Purple. And she says that she wanted to make something like a crazy quilt, something that jumped back and forth, and something that was also mythical. And I think, she was doing a deep dive. This was about ordinary life, but it was also going to have this powerful mythical undercurrent to it. And I think that the myth, and several critics agree with me, I was not the first onto this, but the myth I think that she had in mind while writing The Color Purple becomes evident when we recall that Philomela wove her tapestry with purple on a white background. There's more. Neely begins writing after she's been raped, and you recall she writes these private letters to God, and she struggles to find a voice to tell her story, to create her identity. And while she's doing all of that, she's also developing a craft. And, I love this company that she sets up, Folks Pants Unlimited. And the beauty of it, that you can make pants that will fit every pair of pants will fit everyone. It doesn't matter what size you are. The pants that are made by Neely are going to fit you. And so Neely finds a way out from the cycle of violence that really doomed her marriage. So, I say, make idle conversation, she says about her and Albert. Every day we're going to read Nettie's letters and sew. A needle and not a razor in my hand, I think. So, a needle and not a razor. She becomes a craftsperson, both a craftsperson and a writer. So Neely's story really resonates with Ovid's account of Philomela. Her pen and needle revise, revisit, and rewrite the story of Philomela's rape, as well as the master narrative of women's subordination in patriarchal cultures. So what Alice Walker does is to create a kind of counter discourse to narratives about muting and silencing women. And also, it doesn't end with the violence that we found in Ovid's story, but there's a kind of reconciliation. So she draws on the legacy of the mythical past and its silenced women who are engaged with handicrafts. But she also looks forward, and hers is a hinge text in many ways. She looks forward to a time when speech, storytelling, writing, and revelation became powerful instruments for women. So there are many other strategies for claiming agency and authority. And Zora Neale Hurston gives her character a slightly different path, similar also in her fictional autobiography, Their Eyes Were Watching God. So Janie is a woman who has been the subject of local gossip. They got me in their mouth now. On the front porch, which is the traditional gathering space for storytelling, on the front porch, she sits with her neighbor, Phoebe, and that's not a typo, it's E-O, Phoebe, and she takes control of her life story by telling it in her own words, not gossip. She banishes gossip. This is going to be her own story, and that tale becomes the volume in the reader's hand. Again, the talking book of African-American writing. So using the vernacular, the speech forms of everyday life, Janie breaks out of her isolation and silence. And she's a woman, remember, she's accustomed to being silenced. Her second husband, a store owner, humiliates her in public when he says, my wife don't know nothing about no speech making. I never married her for nothing like that. She's a woman and her place is in the home. Huddled with Phoebe then on the porch, Janie does what women have been doing through the ages, telling her version of the story. They sat together in the fresh young darkness close together, Phoebe eager to feel and do through Janie, but hating to show her zest for fear that it might be thought mere curiosity. Janie full of the oldest human longing, self-revelation. So Janie then becomes an authority who authors her life story, who creates the talking book, and again in a metacognitive mode, I think, in which muteness, shame, resignation, and submission, all of those abject emotions are put on the run. So other possibilities for heroism include domestic craft. And I'm going to go back here. One chapter of my Heroine book includes detectives, that is, curious women who, like Eve, are seeking knowledge. And women sleuths combine curiosity, wanting to know too much, with care, the drive to solve mysteries and secure justice. So here's Barbara Neely with Blanche on the Lam, her heroine, Blanche White, the clever detective who works as a domestic laborer while seeking justice. And as I mentioned earlier, she's an expert in the art of cooking, cleaning, and sleuthing. Underemployed, but she's quite happy to invert the trope of passing by feigning a lack of smarts, mimicking subordination while getting the better of her employers. And she's something of a trickster housekeeper. As a Black woman, Blanche does what Agatha Christie's Miss Marple does supremely well. She hides in plain sight, playing into a stereotype, all the while taking on the mythical might of Nemesis. Again, this strong mythological undercurrent. Through her race, gender, and social class, she's triply invisible to her employers and to those around her. And she plays dumb. And from the text here, putting on a dumb act was something many Black people considered unacceptable. But she sometimes found it, sorry about that, a useful place to hide. She also got a lot of secret pleasure from fooling people who assumed they were smarter than she was by virtue of the ways she looked and made her living. Once teased by her cousins about her dark skin, Blanche turns herself into a powerful being who, I love this, she can roam around the neighborhood at night unseen, and suddenly she becomes special, she becomes wondrous, she becomes powerful, she can gather knowledge in ways that endow her with what others think of as second sight. So for Blanche, race is a fundamental fact of life, and it puts her at odds with representatives of the law, and also adds social responsibilities unknown to the solitary loner types that make up the traditional ranks of private eyes, male and female. Neely's novel, by the way, also brilliantly draws on the structure of slave narratives. Blanche on the Lam, remember that title? It signifies on slave narratives as well as on detective novels and novels about passing. And finally, I want to close with Angie Thomas's Star Carter, who finds a voice by the end of The Hate You Give. And she learns the craft of telling a story, writing about her friend Khalil. There are actually a host of books about curious girls, curious in the double sense of the term, curious girls who aspire to become writers. And I think here of Louisa May Alcott's Jo March, Anne Montgomery's, Ellen Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables, Francie and Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and Louise Fitzhugh's Harriet the Spy. And writing in many ways continues to be the holy grail for girls in many streaming series. It's think of Rory Gilmore in the Gilmore Girls, who becomes a journalist, up to Hannah Horvath in a series that is tellingly called Girls. And remember, Hannah goes to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and eventually she becomes not so much a novelist, not a writer of fiction, but a social commentator. So the value of finding your voice and becoming a writer in the service of justice, I think, is nowhere more explicitly articulated than in Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give. It's a book that hit a nerve with readers young and old, sounding full chords in ways that very few YA novels, young adult novels, have. The Hate You Give draws readers into the complexities of the Black Lives Matter movement, again, through fictional autobiography. Its emotionally charged perspective on Black communities and on political action connects also with the hashtag Say Their Name movement and the effort to remember victims, to protest their murders, and demand an end to public violence. And tellingly, I think the novel begins with a scream of protest, the piercing scream of Star Carter, a Black teenager who has just witnessed the shooting of her friend Khalil by a white officer, Officer 115, who mistook Khalil's hairbrush for a gun. No, no, no is all I can say, Star writes, at a loss for words. Caught between threats from a local drug dealer to keep silent and the pleas from an activist lawyer to speak out and testify, Star struggles to find her voice and to speak up. What she discovers in the aftermath of the shooting is the importance of speaking up. What's the point of having a voice if you're going to be silent in those moments you shouldn't be? An unwilling heroine who feels unbrave much of the time, she summons the tiny brave part of herself and speaks, telling the story as it happened to the grand jury. And later she deploys what she calls her biggest weapon, and she speaks out. Forget trigger happy. Speaker happy is more my thing, affirming the truism about the pen being mightier than the sword. After telling her story in the present tense, plunging us in medias res, right into the thick of things, Star then begins to speak, and this is toward the end of the novel, in the cadences of bards, griots, and storytellers, reaching back to tell the story of Khalil and to memorialize her friend, endowing him with the immortality once conferred on heroes from the ancient past. So she is to Khalil as Homer was to Achilles. Once upon a time, there was a hazel-eyed boy with dimples. I called him Khalil. The world called him a thug. He lived, but not nearly long enough, and for the rest of my life, I'll remember how he died. Fairy tale? No, but I'm not giving up on a better ending. So I love how she begins her journey. I mean, she's clearly going to become a writer by mimicking the fairy tale style, the oral storytelling style, the formula that was used by women in storytelling circles, and she's going to change the narrative. And after that, she recites the names of the victims of police shootings, moving backwards in time to that little boy in 1955 who nobody recognized at first, Emmett. So she invokes Emmett Till, the 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955 and whose brutal murder made him a powerful catalyst for action in the civil rights movement. And she closes her memoir with the promise, I'll never be quiet. Well, there is much more to say, and I was going to include Toni Morrison in this talk, but I realized that it would require another hour. She is the heroic woman of letters who reclaims African-American folklore and animates the voices of ancestors. Think of Tar Baby and Song of Solomon and how she uses the tropes of African-American folklore. But I will stop now, and I would love to answer questions or hear your comments, and thank you.
Marvelous. Oh my goodness, that's fabulous.
Thank you.
You live in a world where I want to live, a world of fairy tales.
Oh, I get to see all of you now.
Yeah,
Yes,
we're
it is
back.
a utopian place in many ways.
Oh, it was wonderful. Tony also does a talking book with jazz. Jazz is a riff on the trope of the talking book, and it's an astonishing performance. People don't read it like they read The Bluest Eye or Sula or Song of Solomon or Beloved, but it is a formal masterpiece. And she self-consciously, Dwight took the trope of the talking book and made the book talk, and it does. Can I ask you, Maria and I have done a book together. I want to do another one on African folk tales with her, if I could ever persuade her to do that. So I don't want to, I've asked her a million questions and we're very, very good friends, but I never asked you, Maria, how did you get interested in folk tales in the first place? Other than being a kid and having Once Upon a Time.
Oh gosh, yeah, it's a long journey, and it's funny because other than a kid, you say, and yet when I look back, my first encounter with fairy tales was a book in the attic called Die schönsten Kindermärchen der Brüder Grimm. We immigrated to the United States when I was about 5 years old. And this church in Highland Park, Illinois, let us live in this house that had a magical attic. And there was this book, which neither my sister and I could read, but, you know, we talked about, or she told me the stories. She made up her own versions of the stories. And then like many, I put them to the side, I discarded them. You think you growing up, and it was only really post-graduate school. Graduate school, I learned don't study the Brothers Grimm. Those are children's stories. And it was only when I was raising my own children and reading the stories that I realized this is adult fare. And you go back to the versions, all of these anthologies from the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, and it becomes very clear that that the stories have been changed tremendously, that we have to change them if we're going to tell them to small children. And what got me interested, being on a panel with Bruno Bettelheim, which seems totally implausible now, and reading his book, The Uses of Enchantment. And there's a long story there, which I won't go into because many of you know that there's a bad history with Bettelheim. But the book was something of an inspiration for me. And then finally, I think that what created this swerve in my academic career was the fact that whenever I gave a talk about fairy tales or folklore, everyone had a question. That is, and these are tales that get people talking. That was their purpose when they were told around the fireside, when they were told to children, when they were told by adults to adults. So there's something so powerful and so primal in these stories, and they take up, Levi Strauss tells us about how every version of the story belongs to a myth, and fairy tales are part of that cauldron of story that take up all of these cultural contradictions, these problems that we wrestle with, that we've wrestled with over the centuries, and that we've never solved.
Great. Krishna, you want to curate?
Sure.
And Tom, can you take me out of the center of this big screen, please, and put me down with the little boxes? Thank you.
I see a hand.
You do? Okay, I don't quite see it.
I think Dwight, was your hand up, or you're muted though? Oh dear, well, you're contradicting what I just said. As to unmute, okay.
Actually, I didn't have my hand up, but thank you for that. That's fascinating on so many different levels. I don't have a question yet, but I am thinking about all that you suggested, and I'm kind of rethinking what I thought I had read in the works of Alice Walker and Tony and others. So thanks for getting some juices flowing right now. I don't have a question yet, but I hopefully will by the end of the hour.
Oh, yeah, you're reminding me, I had this zany moment while I was writing the book where I thought, wait, every time I read a novel, it seemed to fit my pattern. And I started worrying whether I was becoming too much like Campbell and trying to create a kind of rigid archetype in a way. But then I reminded myself, that what you want to avoid is the stereotype. The archetype is all right because there are variations on a theme. So in some ways, what was fascinating to me was seeing the similarities to what I had set up in my own mind about the heroine, but also recognizing the differences.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer Burton.
It's actually going to be my daughter, Lilia, who asked the question, but Maria, wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Hi, I want to say first, that was extraordinary, and I think you're extraordinary, and I'm so grateful that I get to be here to listen to this talk. I have always loved fairy tales, in part definitely inspired by your books, which I grew up reading thanks to my mom who got them for me. And I had a question about this archetype that you're talking about with the heroine and the 1001 Faces. So, of course, fairy tales from all different cultures, I've noticed, have very different depictions of women. Some of them have specific story types, like the one where there's a woman who gets a gift from some like magical creature or 3 magical creatures from doing good deeds. And then other cultures, when I read anthologies, they just have no women in them. And so I was wondering, when you were going through and trying to create this archetype, how you balance, because these different types from that lie in different areas of culture around the world.
Oh, yes. Well, you're actually articulating one of the great challenges of writing this, because, we've all sort of gone global in a way. And we've decided, no, we don't have to know every single language. We don't have to know the languages and the cultures in depth. It's the story that counts. And, what you described, you suddenly become aware of these tremendous differences. And yet, I picked up, Princeton just published a new volume of Chinese folk tales, and I almost fell off my chair because there were stories that had this extraordinary resemblance to the Brothers Grimm, and yet they were stories that were collected in the 19th, and I don't think they were influenced by the Grimms at all. And they were, again, so different and so much the same. I guess, maybe to just respond to one of the many issues you raised in your question. What about the old woman, for example? Is she demonized in all cultures? Are the stepmothers and the witches found in every single culture? And why is that? Is it because fairy tales take us into the family and into the conflicts in the family and amplify them and make them violent? It seems to me that I've been told that in South American cultures, the abuela is quite kind. The old woman is not demonized the way she is in European cultures. And yet I have a feeling that if you started to dig very deeply, you could certainly find some witches, outsiders, and evil women in those fairy tale collections as well. So I think what you described is this puzzle that it's as if you have this gigantic puzzle and are constantly putting pieces into it, and yet not always seeing the big picture, sometimes seeing just the details. But that's part of what makes it so interesting, I think, too, is that the pieces, even as it's a kind of puzzle, the pieces it's a moving puzzle in a kind of zany way.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think Toby Levin has a couple of questions. There
Yes,
she is.
yes. Can you hear me? Thank
Yeah.
you. Also, I join everyone. I thought that was a fantastic talk, very inspiring. My questions are quite simple. I've been struggling to find a word I knew, which means that historical reality is often as the basis of myth and fairy tale. And I was just wondering if you could remember that word for me. And the second is a mythic queen in Somalia called Arawilo. And if you have happened to encountered her, she is heroic in many of the male senses of the word.
I will say no to the second question. I'm sorry. But the first question, the historical basis for these stories, really interesting. And I recommend reading Robert Darnton's book, The Great Cat Massacre, which has a chapter on Mother Goose. It begins with Charles Perrault in France. And it argues basically that there is a kind of historical basis to these stories. That is, stepmothers were by nature cruel because they wanted their biological children to inherit, and so on. And the question is, how did these stories move from historical reality, the facts, the hard facts of life, to fantasy? And it seems to me that the answer to that is really very clear, because you can imagine going back to the firesides, going back to storytelling, a girl, a wolf, an encounter in the woods. This would be a story that you would tell not just to small children, but to adults as well. Watch out. Not necessarily don't stray from the path, which is the lesson that the Grimms derived from the story, but watch out in the woods because there are beasts out there. And then over time, that beast became a sexual predator, a human, because we are now at the top of the food chain. So there's an interesting way in which these stories evolve, but they're always picking up bits and pieces of reality. They're sort of like magnets. They're shaped by fantasy, but there's always, I think it's Calvino who says, the story becomes more beautiful when you add something to it. And that something is that little piece of reality that makes it relevant to our own time and place. And it's a way of making the story new and making it speak to us. So you were looking for a term though, right? And
Yeah, there is a word that encapsulates that idea. I'll find it eventually.
Residue. I think that there's a critic who talks about the residue, the factual residue of fairy tales. And if you email me, I'll try to come up with the title of the book.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Professor Tatar, I'm very struck by the description of the tongue, which continues to move and be animated in Ovid, even after it's cut out. And I'm struck by the kind of the modern sensibility of that description. I was wondering if you could speak on that and how Ovid may have been somewhat of a feminist, or might have been heralding your work in terms of reconsidering the characteristics of a heroine.
Oh, well, that's a fascinating question. We know so little about it. I wish we had more context, more historical context. There is a biography, an attempt to construct a biography of Ovid, but yes, that quivering tongue, gosh, you're right. It's straight from a horror film. You can almost see, I mean, it's as if it's cinematic, that moment. It's as if the camera is zooming in on the tongue, which is quivering on the floor. And I think we get almost 4 lines of that. And clearly, Ovid is on Philomena's side. But of course, the story ends, I didn't mention the ending, which is talk about a cycle of violence. The 2 women, the 2 sisters, kill Etis, Tereus' son, with Procne, and feed him to Tereus. So revenge or violence begets more violence in a way. So that, I think it's slightly problematic to think of him as being a feminist, in that the violence exacted by the women is so horrific and so terrible that it doesn't dwarf what Tereus does, but it certainly does not make them look good by any stretch of the imagination. So yes, well, in a sense, horror, modern horror reaches back, I think, to myth, fantasy, and fairy tale. So thank you for pointing that out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, if we don't have more questions, maybe can I hear from the fellows?
Sure, the fellows are in the audience as
Can
well.
they just quickly introduce
Oh,
themselves?
that's a great idea. Yes. Let me see.
Or is it too difficult with muting and unmuting?
I don't think so. I think that's a great idea. And perhaps I'll just go down in the order of my screen. Rita Fried, would you like to begin?
Hi, thank you for a fascinating talk. Rita Fried, my field is ancient Egyptian and Nubian antiquity. And needless to say, I found your tales have resonance in antiquity as well, and the heroines, who are often portrayed as very masculine, by the way. And I'm here to make an effort to get Nubian culture better known generally.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Dwight Andrews.
Okay, hi. Again, I'm Dwight Andrews, and I am a musicologist, music theorist, and I'm working on a book on spirituality and jazz during my time with these wonderful fellows.
Wonderful. Great.
Thank you. Michael Burraway.
Hi. Yeah, that was pretty interesting. I'm a bit obsessed with Du Bois. And I was wondering, actually, I'm working on figuring out his place in sociology and Marxism, but I was wondering what Du Bois would have to say about these fairy tales. After all, he did produce this amazing Brownies monthly that was all for children. But I don't know, perhaps Dr. Gates will tell us. I don't know to what extent fairy tales figured in those. It lasted for what, I think 2 years, figured in those magazines.
Oh, well, folklore and spirituals. But Skip, do you want to add to that at all? And
No, not any more than, Du Bois loved stories. I mean, he created the tale of, he took the word Negro and made an anagram out of it. He created a fairy tale, the tale of Orgne the something. And then he did these pageants, the Ethiopian pageant, and which were melodramas. Right. He was a master of the essay, but not of fiction. He couldn't, it would get out of proportion for him. I don't think he respected the form. I think he was too this worldly. But he loved story. And I just taught The Souls of Black Folk and just reread it for the first time in years. And he was concerned to exploit the figurative power of language, even if he were writing about the Philadelphia Negro. He, in a letter to his editor, when he was finishing Black Reconstruction, he said he needed more time to put the poetry in it. He had a draft, but he wanted to go back and and you could see all the alliteration and all the odd constructions, and you could tell that was the frosting that he put on sociology. So he loved the art and artistry, right? Or the artistry and art. But I don't, he didn't weave he didn't create the ultimate fairy tale, which I don't think has been created in the African-American tradition outside of Brer Rabbit and Brer Bear and, all of that stuff. But what do you think, Maria? You're the expert.
One thing, I love that, the ultimate fairy tale. Are we still waiting for that?
Absolutely.
Well, Yeah, but you know, there's the Urmärchen, the archetypal, the primal fairy tale. We're always searching for the original, and there is none. And maybe at the other end of the spectrum, there's the ultimate one, the perfect one, which we'll also never get to, but we keep trying. And
No, I meant one that becomes, it's like the Greek legends, you know, the gods, you know, a body of tales that keep being told over and over and over again in the Black tradition. Not too many people are talking about Brer Bear and Brer Rabbit anymore, right?
well, that's true. But, you know, if you think of things like the myth of the flying Africans, I mean, that's been revived by rappers, and it continues to be retold. But, you know, I remember when I was teaching a few years ago, I mentioned flying Africans in a lecture course. And then I referenced Virginia Hamilton's The People Could Fly. And I asked if anybody had read that volume or knew the myth or legend. And not a soul in the class raised his or her hand. It was quite extraordinary. And so, yeah, so I think the time has come sort of to bring these stories back and to have them sort of, I was going to say recycled. Recycled is not really the right word, but retold, re-energized, and made relevant for our own world.
I mean, no, Zora Neale Hurston writes about High John the Conqueror, right? But I don't think any of my students ever heard of High John the Conqueror or Staggerly or maybe Brer Rabbit and Brer Bear, but if so, because of Disney, right?
That's right. Yeah,
And,
exactly. Exactly.
And I worry about that loss of memory, that loss of continuity. It's not good for literature, and I don't think it's good for people either.
Yeah, and if even Toni Morrison could not bring it back, you realize that it's a real problem. But who knows? I mean, we still have time, you know. And these things come in waves, also. So it may change. There may be a sudden inflection point.
Thank you. James Smethurst, another current fellow.
Hi, thank you for this is really great. I was, you know, like Dwight, I'm sort of processing what you said, and I don't think I have anything that rises to the level of a.
Oh, you don't need to ask a question. Just tell me who you are and what you're working on.
Yeah. Well, but I was going to say, I'm working on. I'm at UMass. I'm teach at the Department of Afro-American Studies at UMass Amherst, and I've written a fair amount about the Black arts movement of the 1960s and 1970s, in which heroism, male and female, figures quite a lot in various genres. But you know, one of the things that I was trying to process is that often the story of the hero involves a betrayal that's a little bit different than the sort of arc that you were tracing out. I'm trying, you know, so like I said, it doesn't rise to the level of a question, but something I'm trying to process.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Adulu?
Hi. That talk was very fascinating, Professor Tatar. And I'm Adulu Bitam. I'm coming from the University of Douala, and I'm a fellow in residence at the center. Actually, I'm a joint fellow in residence at the Edmund J. Sapra Center for Ethics and at the Hutchins Center for African American Research. I don't think that is a question but I'm kind of processing and relating to what you say, because in Cameroon, as far as I know my culture, we don't have fairy tales, but we do have tales. But actually, what people the characters in the tales are most of the times animals, and we use these tales to kind of making sure that children are aware of the hierarchy, most of the time of social hierarchy. So there is a kind of moral lesson at the end to teach you these are the elders, this is how you should do, you should behave in front of people and such things like that. And primarily I'm interested in Africa and in art and in modern and contemporary art. And one of the features of the modern art is that there's a pretension to influence the reality. So I was wondering, I don't know if this is interesting or not, but how far or to what extent these fairy tales, especially taught in the modern world and by modern writers, especially by modern female writers, bear, if that is the case, the pretension to act and to influence the reality, to have a significant, I may say a resonance or something like that on the actual human beings in flesh and blood. Is that something that was intended by the authors?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think of them as sort of golden nuggets of wisdom that are passed on from one generation to the next. And storytelling was originally a way of just, passing on news, information, experience, lessons, and all of that. And gradually, they morphed into, think of cultures where, where print is not available, where you have to talk to people and pass on information. You're also keeping more in your brain. I think that, a lot of times we think our brain is in our laptop or in our cell phone, in our smartphone. The phone is smart, whereas our brain is going dead because we store everything in there. So these were definitely told to educate people. I remember talking to someone who said his entire education, he came to the United States and got a PhD, but as a child, his education came via stories. He didn't read books. And now, we're sort of in this new era where the stories have been repurposed for the young, even though I would argue that they're all over adult culture. But there is this effort to use the stories to educate children, to teach them lessons, to send messages. Something that I find profoundly problematic because the wisdom, the information, the knowledge comes from talking about the story, not so much from the story as the conversation that takes place post-story, when you might argue with the message that is encapsulated in the tale. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Tanya.
Hi, I'm an associate professor in the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. And the whole time during your talk, questions were swirling around in my head about the process of gendering, how these stories are central to the gendering practices that we inherit as US African Americans, and all of these other questions. And just to one point about the conversation that you and Skip were having about memory and the legacy and inheriting these folk tales, which, by the way, I bought a copy of your book, and I hope that maybe at some point I can figure out a way to get you both to sign it for my daughter so she can have that, right, to access. But that's one of the things that I'm interested in, is thinking about how these types of stories are retold in different forms throughout the diaspora within the Americas, particularly in Patakis and other places where we have these sort of stories of history and at different points that might be useful and accessible. But I couldn't think of a really great question to ask, but those are just some of the thoughts that I was having while I was listening to your presentation.
Thank you for that. And we will sign anytime.
Absolutely. And we'll sign them for your aunt, your uncle, Christmas, Kwanzaa, whatever you want.
Mark Burford.
There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Mark Burford. I'm a musicologist at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and I'm working on a project on Du Bois's proximity to music through his writings, but also through his editorship and through his various associates. And like Jim and Dwight, I don't have a specific question, though I reread Du Bois's Dark Water recently, and which intersperses essays with fiction and poetry. And some of those stories, I'm thinking specifically of the Princes of the Hither Isles, and which has that kind of fantasy, once upon a time framing as well too. So I kind of agree with Skip's assessment about his writing of fiction versus his writing of nonfiction. But that's an interesting instance where he seems to be dabbling in fairy tale.
On my to be read list. Thank you.
Thank you. Susanna.
Hi there, I'm Susanna Ashton. I'm a professor of American literature at Clemson University in South Carolina, but here in the spring, up here for the spring as a fellow. My area of expertise is the writing of fugitives, the writing of people, survivors of slavery, and particularly authorship and sort of what's at stake and sort of anonymity and authorship and that sort of work. And one of the things I was sort of chewing on as I listened to your talk is one of the problems you see, particularly in male narratives about enslavement, but also in women, is the tension between putting forth oneself as a hero. You can obviously see this, for example, as Frederick Douglass, like, and I did this and I overcame that and I am a hero. And yet also the tension, because being a hero differentiates you from your community. And if you're a hero, does that mean everybody else is a loser who you left behind? I mean, right? You've got that tension between representing yourself as a hero and representing your community who hasn't been given the voice to write their story. And some people navigate this very awkwardly, some less so. Some are very conscious of the tension and some seem sort of oblivious of it. But again, the problem with the hero, and this is often gendered, but not always, the problem with the hero in any of these tales is that you are differentiating yourself from others in some way. And that's both beautiful and important to selfhood, and yet it's tragic and detrimental and cruel and sad and not helpful, right? In terms of advancing your story and everyone's story, right? Your story should be to bring everyone's story to the fore. Anyway, so I'm thinking of the role of the hero in that way, which isn't a very Joseph Campbell way at all, right? But I'm wondering how it figures on other tropes of fairy tales. Thanks, this was fun.
Thank you. That's such a great point. And it reminds me that I have to write a sequel to this book. And, you know, one way of getting around it is to think of heroism with a lowercase heroism and uppercase, but then that's problematic too. But you're exactly right. I mean, the fact that, I mean, ordinary people are heroic. If you think about what it takes to get through life, to raise children, to care for relatives who are, you know, all of that. And I think on a very trivial, banal level, I remember I was on my exercise bike, so I have an excuse for this, but I was watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians. I think it was the last episode in which they were talking about their journey, the journey that they had been on. And I thought, oh my God, you know, this has become so trivialized in a way. But then I realized, you know, this was, you know, a terrible ordeal for them in many ways. And they didn't come back with a healing elixir. They came back with something that was pretty toxic. So the heroism of everyday folks, and you're right, you know, putting somebody up there on a pedestal, it has an upside and a downside. But for that, we all the more important to think hard about what it takes to make a hero and who we put up on that pedestal and why. So thank you.
Thank you. I think Anne Daventry in the audience has a question.
I do, thank you. Sorry to interrupt the fellows' introductions, but I finally figured out how to articulate this, so I wanted to speak up. This dichotomy between the hero as a man of action and the heroine as a woman of endurance. I'm wondering, in your research and just reading in general, when you've come across queer or androgynous figures in the stories, where they tend to fit in this dichotomy when they don't fit into the gender sort of dichotomy.
Oh gosh, another great point. And, you know, again, something that I'd like to take up again, although I'm not certain that I'm capable of it. The excuse that I made in my introduction for not addressing what you just described is that I was looking backwards. And, you know, to a time, you know, we live in an era that is gender fluid, where things have changed dramatically. And so, and can we even use the term androgynous anymore? Is that, you know, that itself is problematic. So it's something, what you just described is something that I did not take up in the book, and that, you know, maybe one of you can comment on it in one way or another, but clearly, to me, it looks as we look to the future, it seems to me that there's going to be a merging of these two models in some ways that is gender, that isn't gendered. There won't be this strong bifurcation. And, you know, think of Jason Mott, who's writing a book, which is to a great extent autobiographical. I mean, it's fiction, but it's still, so there's so many autobiographical features to it, where he becomes something like a hero. He crosses over in a way. So what you're describing is immensely complicated. And, you know, I hope you know, some graduate students, some younger colleagues will take this up and let us see the path forward. So thank you for that comment. Very important.
Thank you. Fellow Siku Cook.
Hey, thank you, Krishna. Thanks, Professor Tatar. Excuse me. So my name is Sekou Cook. I'm one of the Nazir Jones Hip Hop Fellows, and I am Professor of Architecture here at UNC Charlotte, where I'm the director of the Urban Design Program, and I also write about hip hop architecture. And your talk was fascinated to me in many ways. You know, from a just a basically structural point of view, understanding how we can find these connected narrative threads between these different stories, and going back to different mythologies or fairy tales. Just that basic structure of it is really fascinating to me, and the fact that we find these alignments whether the alignments are intentional or not. But beyond that, I think when you were starting to talk about the color purple and the fact that craft or creativity, production with the hands becomes an outlet for empowerment, I thought that was particularly fascinating. So yeah, so thank you.
Oh, thank you. And you put it in a better way than I did. The link with creativity, yeah, and artistic production. I'm going to write that down.
You're welcome.
Thank you. As you're writing it down, perhaps Celine Lachey can speak.
Thank you, Krishna. Hi, thank you, Professor Tatar, for your presentation. I am Céline Larcher. I am French. I am a historian and political scientist at the CNRS, French National Center for Scientific Research. I am here at the Huntington Center working on a project on Afrofeminism. It's French Black feminism in the current context of France. I conducted an inquiry, an ethnographical inquiry in Paris, in the suburbs, with daughters of immigrants from Sub-Saharan Africa and from the Caribbean. I am myself from Martinique. And thank you for your talk. I don't have any question really, but when I was listening to you, I was thinking of all those women I met who are between their 20s and 30s, who complain about the fact that they, in the public sphere in France, you don't really have Black female models, though we have Black female writers like Maryse Condé, Simone Schwarzbart, and Gisèle Pinault, who we are all three from Guadeloupe, and who are very studied here in the United States. And in the public debate, we don't hear a lot of French Black women voices. So I was thinking about the importance of the transmission and the legacy of stories, yes, but also of figures in how to address critical narratives in the public debate on race, on inequalities, on gender, on feminism, on class divisions, etc. And I will have to think more sociologically on the absence, the invisibility of all those Black French women who exist in French society and in the French Caribbean, but who are not under the light in the French metropole, as we say. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for pointing out, the real life implications of this. That is putting the heroines, the writers or social critics as heroines in the spotlight. Yeah.
You're muted, Krish.
Sorry, David Bidenman. I think you have to unmute yourself, David.
Oh, I do know David from way back when I was a fellow. So, oh, there you are.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can. Well, I'm actually on a bus going to a memorial meeting for an old friend. And I've just passed the Houses of Parliament, way to the Tate Gallery. Anyway, just to say that I've been working with Skip for many years on the image of the Black and Western art, and have just putting to bed really the 12th volume in the series, and hoping to start on the next and probably final one. Did you hear that?
Yes,
we did.
Achievement, 12 volumes. Wow.
And there'll never be a final one.
Point.
The image of the Black in the 22nd century.
Right. Okay.
Wendell Patrick.
Yes, hello. Wendell Patrick, assistant professor at Peabody Conservatory of Music, and one of the NAS fellows here this year. Just wanted to say that was a really fascinating talk, and as the child of a Jamaican mother and Trinidadian father, there were all kinds of stories in my home told by my parents and relatives, and one of my favorite things to do was also to fill up a little plastic Ziploc. This was actually pre-Ziploc, so they didn't actually zip it. These little bags with ice cubes, and then go up to my room and eat ice cubes while I read stories. And so I actually do have a question, which I just realized I was talking about this with a friend last week, which is, and I thought about it also when you were telling the story about the protagonist who killed a wife every night for, over 1,000 days. That's extremely violent. And there's so many nursery rhymes where people are getting thrown in ovens or, eaten by whatever, and I was talking to a friend and just thinking about, if these stories were actually rendered not as fairy tales, but as films, these would be incredibly violent. And so I'm just curious, when I would read these, I never really found them problematic at all, right? But then we hear in hip hop or film or music, all of these protests sometimes against artistic statements and about the influence that these have on children and ultimately society and community. And I'm just wondering, and maybe there are discussions about this, but why is there not more discussion about nursery rhyme content and the effect that it potentially has without people really thinking about it? And this also speaks to Tanya's comment about sort of gendering. It's just presented in every single fairy tale. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Sexual assault and violence. Yeah. Well, remember before I mentioned the golden nugget of wisdom, and you're drawing attention to something quite different. The violence in these stories. John Updike once wrote that fairy tales were the television and pornography of an earlier age. So again, these were tales that were meant to pass on wisdom, experience, knowledge, and all of that. But they also were designed to keep people awake, often while they were carrying out repetitive household chores. And, think of those long winter nights where people are sewing, spinning, repairing tools and all of that. How do you keep people? You tell a good story. And so I think that, explains some of the violence there. It is, Shahryar. I don't know how many wives. It's Shaharazad who tells 1,001 tales, but Shahryar has racked up quite a number of murders already. And in so many of the anthologies from the 19th century, you find that women are the targets of violence. But there are also many stories in which they save themselves, they rescue themselves by broadcasting their stories and all of that. So what you raise is a huge, complicated question about violence in the stories. And when we move them into the nursery, what happens to them? Do we edit, censor? Of course we do, because we don't want to read a 5-year-old the story of Bluebeard who kills his wives and is about to decapitate his 7th wife before the story ends with a happily ever after. So yes, thank you for that. Lots to think about there.
I have to, I want you all to keep going. I have another, a 2 o'clock Zoom in 3 minutes. But could you give us a recommendation for the best introduction to fairy tale, the structure of fairy tale, the meaning of fairy tale? So if everyone here wanted to start with one thing before they get to the complete works of Maria Tatar, annotated from W.W. Norton, which I own, by the way, what would you recommend off the top of your head?
Well, there's a volume by Nancy Canepa, C-A-N-E-P-A, called
C-A-N-E-P-A.
EPA, and it's called Teaching Fairy Tales. And the first few essays in that will give you a nice definition of fairy tales and give you some of the background and history. So that's okay. And I think you can also read parts of that on an advance. The book is very expensive, so that's why I'm recommending that you try a Google advanced book search and see if you can get some of the essays on, and of course there's always Widener. So that's a good one. And I have a volume called Classic Fairy Tales, which is one of those Norton critical editions, which has a longish introduction, which kind of summarizes the history of scholarship and everything that you'd expect from those critical editions.
Oh, that's great.
Those are starters. But thank you, Skip. And
big hug. It was fabulous as usual. You all continue.
Can't wait to watch you tonight. Both Finding Your Roots and
Frederick Douglass.
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass at 9 o'clock, everyone, on HBO. I hope you watch it. Anyway, bye-bye. See you guys next week.
Bye. I think I should let everybody off the hook. And what I'm hoping is that I can come in person sometime to an event. Let's hope that things open up in the spring and I can I can I can meet all of you and learn more about your work. But thank you so much for hosting me, Krishna.
Maria, would you mind if two of the last fellows introduce themselves
Oh,
quickly?
not at all. No, no. I just didn't want to keep people. If people have to go to 2 o'clock, go ahead but I'd love to meet the last. Yes.
Yes, there's no compulsion, but if you would like to.
No, definitely.
Laura, would you like to speak if you have a moment? I think you have to unmute.
I'm sorry, we're going back and forth with this like pop-up that's like unmute yourself. So thank you so much, Krishna. Thank you so much, Professor Tatar, for this talk. You took me back to my childhood growing up Egyptian in Kansas. And there was a time in my life when my mother was living in Egypt, and I had a little brother. He was 6 years old when my mother was living there. And he didn't get to grow up hearing my mom tell him all the fairy tales. Like Shaharazad was one of the fairy tales that she told us when we were growing up in Lawrence, Kansas. So she recorded an audio tape, cassette tape, and she mailed it to us. And so we still have that. And we let my little brother listen to that growing up. And it was nice to hear her voice. I'm just thinking about the chain of transmission and how much that's an active part of the story and the storytelling process. And then also how that shapes our cultural understanding and our ability to relate to other places that maybe we've never been to, that may not even exist. But yeah, now we're using that same audio tape. Yes, we still have a tape player. And my niece and nephews are listening to those stories today. So it's just really nice to see you doing this work. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Wonderful. I love that, passing it down from one generation to the next. And there's a beautiful new edition of the, it's called the Arabian Nights, not the 1001 Nights, put out by W.W. Norton. It's one of those big volumes with lots of illustration and commentary. And that is also a great, it's a great gift book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did you edit that one as well?
Oh, no, gosh, I couldn't possibly. It's edited by Paulo Horta, who is at NYU. And I cannot remember the name of the translator, but it's a new translation and much more faithful to the text than the others by Burton and various other translators.
Thank you for the reference. And finally, Tadiwa.
Hello, my name is Tadiwa, and I'm a graduate student here at Harvard in African American Studies. I do African literature, specifically Southern African literature. I am not the graduate student with the answers, but I do work on queer literature in relation to Anne's question. And usually in the Zimbabwean context, there are intersex heroes, for example, in praise poetry that in some ways it brings up a certain crisis of which traits go with particular intersex figures. But on the other hand, pre-colonial praise poetry has its own gender system. So it's interesting when queer writers, contemporary queer writers, try to reclaim these figures in praise poetry, in traditional praise poetry, through the lens of kind of contemporary gender sexuality discussions. So I do work a little bit on that, but not really in the context of folk tales and stuff like that, just interested in contemporary queer Zimbabwean literature.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Maria, do you have a favorite heroine?
Oh, Shaharazad, of course. I think it has to be Shaharazad because, why? Because everything about her, I mean, she's a reader, she's a scholar, she's interested in poetry, And there's just something so beautiful about the way that she manages to conquer violence and change her culture. So I guess I would put her as number one, the 1001, and she is number one in that the singular one in the ranks of heroines.
And she saves all the women who come after her, right?
Yes, I mean, she puts an end to this terrible, I mean, imagine living in a culture where this kind of thing, and imagine, you know, her father turns her over. He agrees when she says, I want to volunteer. She's like Katniss in the Hunger Games. I volunteer. And her father says, fine, that's good. No, I mean, what an extraordinary story. Yes. So how about you, Krishna?
Oh, I don't know fairy tales very well, but I think Shaharazad is definitely up there. I've always been intrigued by her, but I have only read versions previous to the new translations. So
well, take a look at this new one. Yeah,
yes, thank you. I will. Well, thank you very much for a great session. Thank you. Abby, would you like to say anything?
No, just thank you. And I actually, Krishna had, when she was talking about the tongue wiggling on the floor, that made me think about horror films, because I actually was interested knowing what your familial relation to horror films is. Maria's son-in-law, right, is the producer Jason Blum, I think, of Blumhouse. Is that right, Maria?
Yes, Jason Blum, who produced Get Out.
Get Out, exactly. So, but it just occurred to me, I've been watching more horror films recently because my daughter has gotten into them. And there's always a woman, or not all, often a woman who's too curious for her own good, right? She opens doors she's not supposed to open, and she digs into things she's not supposed to dig into, but often, I guess usually, I'm just learning the genre, so I can't generalize yet, but saves herself and many others around her. So anyway, so that was just my little comment about this, but thank you so much. It's so, and I love the fact that you asked the fellows to introduce themselves, because this is one of our public colloquia. So some of our other audience members got to meet our fellows. And one of the hardest things for me about the pandemic is that we haven't been able to share our fellows with our public as much as I would like to, because they're wonderful. So and you're a model of the alumna fellow. So thank you so much for being with us today, Maria.
Oh, thank you. Great to see all of you.
And see you again soon.
I hope so. Take care, everyone.